Hello, hello. Ken Lane here, API Evangelist, for another one of my API Evangelist conversations where I just bring in interesting folks who are doing interesting things with APIs and see what they're up to. So let's not waste any time. Let's bring in our guest and see who we have. Hello, who are you?
Hi there, I'm Derek Thompson. I am both an API engineer by trade, but I also work sort of in our space. I worked at Stoplight for quite a while before and through the acquisition by SmartBear, and now I'm over at Ambassador working on our new API platform, Blackbird. And I focus mainly on our new AI integration. So all the stuff we're trying to get the LLMs to do for us to help out along the way of you know building new and updating existing API projects and testing and validating those projects. Anywhere we can find to sort of point these guys to help out a little bit is what we're trying to do.
I like it. I like it. Well, thank you for your service, Derek. I'm a big fan of stoplight work. And I'm a big fan of people who survive the Smart Bear acquisition experience and end up going to other places. But we'll just leave it there. And I think you're at the right place, building the interesting things. And so I came across we are having me in your community. I was having a conversation with you all about the merits of SDK generation and OpenAPI, and we kind of got on the subject of AI SDK generation, and I had some thoughts and concerns around the cost of doing that, not just financial, but around OpenAPI and what we're building. Let's start with just what do you guys offer, like ground zero, like what are you connecting AI to do when it comes to the API lifecycle right now?
Yeah, and I do sort of want to clear up a little bit. We don't actually do client SDK generation out of Blackbird.
Okay.
Our generation and code generation is pointed at the server implementation itself, so your API. So we have sort of like the first thing we rolled out was just a basic chatbot that allows you to generate a new service spec. You can pick your version and go ahead and create your OpenAPI specification. And then the second thing we rolled out, well, with that, we also included some AI tools for auto fixing existing specifications and the one you're creating on the fly. So doing basic syntax checking, we're integrating spectral lineing in now so that you can auto fix any spectral lineing rules and sort of supply your custom rule sets. And then the other piece of that, of course, is we wanted to offer an activity where you can update your existing OpenAPI spec. And the idea there for us is that kicks off sort of your workflow. Like the way we want people to be able to use Blackbird is very much in line with sort of the OpenAPI initiative design first flow. The idea is you come together as a team and you sort of collaborate on what you want to change, and you express that first with the AI in an iterative activity in terms of changing the underlying specification.
Yeah.
And that's really, like, I think where we have a big advantage over the sort of standard code gen cases where you're just trying to say, here's, like, say, a Git repo. It could be any style application. It could be anything. Can you make changes to it? We have that specification. It's almost like a roadmap to your existing implementation, right? Like, it's pretty easy to start correlating what's in that spec to actually handler code and different things like that. And then the Git metadata actually does a really good job, if you analyze it, of sort of allowing you to do nearest neighbor groupings of related code. So you look for the handler code, and then what you find from the metadata is it's related to changes there tended to correspond with like some new database queries over here, some new tests down here, some new types or structs over here to handle the response and request bodies, all that stuff, and can see that pattern and use that to at least do a first pass of generating the initial. Now, we run into the limits of these LLMs all the time. I'm not saying it's generating working code right off the bat. It tends to find the right locations, which is important to me because it gives me a place to start with. I can go in and start polishing the code and actually make it work. But I think that sort of flow and that idea that what's sort of changing as we introduce these LLMs isn't what I'm doing as an engineer, because the important part I'm playing is the intention, right? Like what I want to change, how I want it done. all the experience I've learned over time in terms of how to implement those changes, all that stuff. That's the value I'm bringing, I think, more than actually being in an IDE and just like punching out a ton of code, which I do a lot too, and I enjoy doing that. But I do think we're going to see a big change to that process being more like directing the LLMs, getting that round of changes in, reviewing that as a human, giving them a second round of directions on fixing, and sort of getting a UX experience that's much more about me using human language to describe what I want to happen, and about the LLMs taking that and executing on those instructions.
Yeah. Thanks for that. I think that's a really important distinction. I think why you're here to have this conversation, and why I thought it was an interesting one to have is I've been at this front line for 15 years of startups coming along and building tools and that offer value to enterprises. And a lot of times those extract value and kind of move value up into the cloud and de-emphasize kind of expertise and people doing things. And I think client SDK generation is a common way is people it requires a very complete open API definition to do really good client SDK generation. And so teams have to do that work. And a lot of, I won't name names on the AI front, are coming in and saying, hey, all you got to do is just let us generate, give us your spec, we'll complete it, we'll do it. And that's kind of an outsourcing of your intellectual property, and you're not doing that work. But you guys are on the server side generation. So there's a space between mock and production code that I think is super fascinating and needs a lot of help and clarity and visibility and work, this conversation. But you guys are continuing that feedback loop while respecting that spec and that open API core, because that's kind of the accumulation of your intellectual property and expertise as a company. And so all you're talking about doing is you're bringing in wider context, wider awareness, and reinforcing that and allowing developers to just focus on what they do best rather than the rest of that.
Yeah, absolutely. We're trying to just get rid of the sort of like boilerplate code generation part of our existing process, right? And I do think like what we're going to find, and what we are finding already, I think we had sort of talked offline a little bit and mentioned like, where are we at in terms of like, there's generally this S curve in terms of capabilities, right? And we're obviously been on this uptrend with the LLMs and their underlying base model capabilities for a while. And it's really quite interesting and challenging to develop developer tooling right now in this sort of shifting sand landscape of AI, because I don't want to develop tooling that's going to be obsolete the next time a model drops, right? Like, and you don't want to do that. So one of the things I sort of seen, and I think there's some strong signal around that's making me a little selfishly optimistic and happy in terms of continuing to be an engineer at all and sort of slinging code for a living, is that I do think we're seeing in a couple different ways that the core capabilities of the underlying models, at least these transformer-based revolution that we're sort of been riding for a while, we're definitely seem to be getting into that realm of diminished returns. Like, I think one of the reasons we're seeing a longer period of time between the drops of the major models, and it is specifically because like they're just not getting the improvements by throwing a ton of extra NVIDIA at it. And they're not getting the improvements they were hoping to get by throwing a ton of extra synthetic data into the training sets. I think they get an echo effect, and it's not as helpful as they were hoping it was going to be. And then on the other hand, you see, DeepSeek come out, and you get this idea that, man, you maybe didn't need that much of that like horsepower in the initial training anyways. And all those things, when I look at them together, tell me like we had this big revolution and we pushed up these base capabilities really quickly, but that might be leveling out. We might not see like the improvements when you're just talking about like a single iteration. I've given you some context, some input context, you pass it into the network and we get some output context. I don't think we're going to continue to see the rapid improvements there that we've been seeing. So I think what actually where you are seeing the improvements today are more like have you used the Claude Code system at all, or any of these? Okay,
I've played with it.
Yeah, and I think the improvements there, and I had a colleague use it and tell me it looked like black magic to him when he was watching it make changes in the files in real time and stuff like that. I don't think it's black magic. I think they've done a really good job of pre-analyzing your Git repo and doing some embeddings and doing some nearest neighbor indexing. And I think they're able to look at what you've done and sort of trace through that. But what I'm getting at is I think the improvements we're going to see over the next few years are going to be more about how can we give these guys the correct context? Like, how can we seed that context and also manage that context for multiple trips through the model? So as you're coming out, you're updating some stateful context in the background. It's sort of also keeping track of, I'm involved in a multi-step task, not a single pass task, and here's how I'm working through it. But again, we're not improving the ability of that output to be correct. You're still going to have the hallucinations. You're still going to have all the stuff we're seeing today. We're just going to be producing code with the same sorts of hallucinations at time, but contextually matching more of like what you've done in the past, because we're gonna use your past Git history and what you've been doing to sort of point the LLMs in the right direction.
Yeah, and that makes me happy because I feel like, I feel frustrated. What you said about being a programmer is like I've been moving forward, mocking and doing this design first API. I create an open API and then I iterate upon it and I create examples and I generate some docs and get feedback from stakeholders and from different teams and groups. And then I'll bring in security and product owners and we kind of layer on to this open API. And as I'm doing this work, I see startups come along saying, oh, you don't need to do all of that. Just upload it and our LLM will take care of everything. And I'm like, wait, no, like me working with my product stakeholders, me working with security, like there's a lot of value in me as a developer doing this. And yes, I love using Claude or ChatGPT to write my descriptions for me, generate examples, iterate on different pieces and different things. And that road from a static mock API to production, all of that strength built in there as an individual or as an enterprise is super valuable. And I don't want to outsource all of that, but I do want you to write all my examples and my boilerplate code and all my descriptions and my examples and let me do what I do best. And it really sounds like that's where you guys are investing.
That is 100%. And I'm glad you mentioned the example. The examples is like one of the things I wanted to go after right away, because I have written so many examples and changed them for my mocks to give me specific responses so I can test different things. So just having tooling that allows you to rapidly, like, one of the things we're exploring, it's not in the product right now, it's something we're still working on, is using overlays and generating overlays rapidly to update your example sets to give your mock different sort of context depending on what you're trying to do, or even updating it during a long run of some validation tests so that you can change the responses that are coming back for the specific tests. And having an AI generate those examples for me and sort of like work through a big group of them and just make sure they're somewhat consistent over time. Again, I still feel like where we're at, there's still the need for a human to then come in and do a visual inspection or run it and make some improvements. You don't often get like just this works right off the bat from these guys, but it saves me a lot of time anyways, especially when you're talking about generating hundreds of responses and different things like that you want to use in these mock and testing scenarios. It's really coming in handy. So for me, it's all about that. It's like, look at the stuff that's always been painful for us that we complain about to each other when we're doing it, and look for opportunities to teach the LLM to do that sort of basic layer of code gen for us. And let me focus on the interesting stuff. Like, we're working on Arazzo stuff right now. To me, the interesting stuff is how do you build an engine to execute Arazzo documents, right? Like, it's not like how do I produce my first like 20 Arazzo documents that I'm going to use for testing. Like, I'll have the AI do that and then I'll fix them up and then I'll use them in testing, but I don't want to write them by hand anymore, man. That's what we want to get rid of, right?
I mean, I'm an expert level open API person. So I can handcraft open API. I used to be the executive director of the Open API initiative. I have API experience, and I love overlays and I love where Arazzo's going. I have a lot of anxiety about all that work that I'm going to have to do. And then I have a lot of anxiety about my enterprise teams because they're not expert level open API people. and they can't actually be doing that. So I need guardrails and I need a lot of automation to help them be more effective in what they're doing. But I still need them to learn along the way and understand what's happening under the hood.
Yeah, and that's something I think that we are going to deal with just as an industry. Software development in general, like you can see it all around us, right? Like it's increasingly hard for college graduates to find jobs. It's increasingly hard for juniors to keep jobs because there's this perception in corporations, in corporate America, that like you can just replace these guys now with LLMs. Just a couple seniors directing these AI. What else do you need? And it's like, when your seniors retire, where are you going to get your next round of seniors to do this work? And that's why I think like it's so important, especially when we're talking in the context of these OpenAPI initiative documents. Like I want to focus our collaboration and work on the documents themselves, right? Like we should be in there understanding as we're making changes to the OpenAPI spec, what that means for the implementation, and working with new members of our teams to explain why we're making these changes, what it means, and go over like, have that opportunity to do some knowledge sharing. And the same thing with tests. Like, it's not going to be great if Arazzo becomes a specification that's completely under the hood all the time. That's just like AI generates them, AI runs them, and that's all. You don't even really know what they are. Because Arazzo, it actually is a very interesting way to explain in a broader context what we're accomplishing with APIs in general and with the OpenAPI specs in general, and the ability to have multiple specs and sort of craft workflows across several services, right? It's important for us to find ways to share that with new people and onboard them on that. And I'm not saying that I have found the solution or I know the solution to that. I think it's something we're going to be dealing with and something we're all going to have to come together and sort of figure out what it means as things shift, to bring new people on, to get them up to speed, to pass on that hard-won experience. And you can't do this job without feeling a little bit like most of that hard-won experience is just hours and hours, often late at night, being down in the code, fixing things, figuring things out, being like, oh, I've always seen another engineer make this change, and I've always sort of just been like, that's interesting, but what does it actually mean? And then you go down rabbit holes and you figure all that stuff out. We're going to have to figure that out, man. We're going to have to figure out what it means to onboard people and bring new developers in and get them up to speed. But there's another part of me that also feels like, man, like the very first program I punched in as a kid into a TI 99.4a was in Hex. I remember quite well because it took me days to punch this thing in. It was a Space Invaders clone. I finally got it working and ran to grab my parents. I was so impressed. I played it once, and my little brother, who was a toddler at the time, walked in and tripped over the power cord, and it was just gone into the ether, man. I didn't have any medium to save it to or anything like that at the time. My point being, I don't want to go back to punching hex in. Like, we have constantly sort of added these layers of abstraction onto that core system, all the way to the point where, like, you have languages like Python that are, it's not human language, but it's close to human language. It's an abstraction that, like, you don't have to necessarily be a software engineer to use, right? Like, you can be a data scientist, you can be someone into statistics and stuff like that, and be able to pick it up and move pretty quickly. So maybe this is just the next level of that. Like, we're just bringing it up and actually getting increasingly to this level where we can just, like, express what we want to do in regular human languages and have the AI pick it up. Again, to do that now, you have to see it with an awful lot of technical context. With the example with Arazzo, that's something that has been difficult simply because, the OpenAPI specification has been around a long time. The training data has millions of examples of these API specs. Some of these models, even the top end ones, their knowledge cutoff is late 23. They don't know anything about Arazzo. To get any, like, sensible results, you actually have to pipe not only the schema in, but also, like, an explanation of what the different components do and what they're for, so it can have any idea of what it's trying to build, right? So,
yeah, but the abstractions are needed. I would say I have my similar story: Commodore 64, programming basic, and then I spilled Kool-Aid all over the keyboard, and that's when the keyboard and the computer was the same thing.
Yes.
And lost it all, man. Lost it all. No backups. On my tape backup, my cassette tape backup,
Yes.
I didn't have a backup. Well, so what you talked about with how you talk about open overlays and Arazzo is I firmly believe, and this is the mission I'm on, this is how we build bridges with product and business when it comes to APIs and these abstraction layers you talk about. So, the overlays is going to be for the support, for the sales, for the internationalization. Arazzo is going to be the business workflows that actually matter to sales and marketing and business folks. So we're out of time now, but you're going to have to come back and have an Arazzo overlays conversation with me. Is that cool?
That is totally cool, Ken. I would really love that, man. It was great talking to you and
Yeah.
appreciate the opportunity.
Yeah. I appreciate you coming by, man. Good stuff. This was exactly the conversation I was looking for. So I appreciate it.
Awesome. Thanks, Ken. Have a great day, man.
Thanks, Derek. Yeah, that was good. That was the kind of separation of layers that I wanted to kind of inject in here as far as that reality layer that's happening right now at the spec level, and still respecting the spec, still understanding the complexity there, but knowing we need a lot of help along the way to get that from idea into production. So good stuff. Look forward to having Derek come back and talk about overlays in Arazzo, which is super critical right now. And yeah, that's it. Thanks, y'all. Appreciate y'all coming by.